I remember the morning as if it had been drawn from water, the Cherwell curled in its usual lazy loops beneath a veil of fog that blurred the banks and softened the edges of everything. Oxford at that hour seemed suspended, a city half in dream, half in reality. I walked along the towpath, the ground damp underfoot, the smell of wet reeds mingling with the faint tang of river mud. The mist hung thick enough to dull the clatter of punt poles and the occasional footfall, yet the distant chime of a college bell struck with peculiar clarity, marking the passage of hours I felt unfit to observe. There was a melancholy in it, the kind that settles into the chest without announcing itself, and I found myself reflecting on the persistence of human endeavour against a backdrop that cared nothing for ambition or grievance. A student passed by, boots soft on the sodden path, and murmured a comment about the smoke over the bridge. I thought nothing of it at first, assuming some chimney or early burner, yet the words clung, a subtle hint that all was not as it seemed. There was the air of suggestion in them, the way a letter might imply more than it says, and I filed it away for the kind of consideration that comes with hours alone, pondering small anomalies as if they were epiphanies. The bridge itself, half hidden in a cloak of mist, took on an almost spectral presence, the arches dark, reflections fractured in the sluggish river. I paused to examine the parapet, noticing a faint streak along the stone, the kind one would ignore if not looking for signs. Perhaps a boat had brushed too close, or perhaps the smear meant something more deliberate. My eye caught a slight inconsistency in the way the fog curled around a lamp-post. The halo suggested wind from the west, though the reeds leaned east. A detail trivial, yet in my experience these are the tendrils from which larger truths may grow. Along the bank, a punt idled against its mooring, no figure in sight. Its varnished sides gleamed damply, and I saw, tucked between cushions, a small notebook, water-stained at the edges. I did not reach for it. Some things demand patience. Observation alone is often more revealing than intrusion. The air carried the faint scent of tobacco, not from me, not from the river. Yet something human had left a trace, a ghost of presence in a landscape otherwise mute. I walked on, noting the irregular pattern of footprints in the soft earth, and wondered who else might have arrived at this hour, whose mind might already be entangled with secrets I had yet to grasp. Oxford is full of intellect, ambition, and an invisible thread of envy, running through its cloisters and inns as steadily as the river itself. There is a loneliness here, one that does not always admit itself, and I was aware of it now, echoing the fog's melancholy, pressing quietly against the spine. The bells tolled again, the sound falling upon the mist, as if it were a prophecy rather than a signal. I sensed that the day would unfold slowly, that the bridge and the river would retain their secrets for some hours yet. And somewhere beyond the fog, something waited, something human and not entirely innocent, which the smoke over the Cherwell, however faint, had already hinted at. I remember the letter arriving without ceremony, slipped beneath the door of my flat on St. Aldate's, its edges soft with the damp of early autumn. The envelope was unremarkable, save for the precision of its fold and the faint impression of handwriting that belonged to no one I could place. I held it in my hand for a moment longer than necessary, aware that these small objects often contain more than mere paper and ink. The faint smell of tea and old parchment lingered, mingling with the lingering trace of last night's whisky, as if Oxford itself had left a subtle signature upon it. I unfolded the sheet carefully, my eyes scanning the lines that at first seemed innocuous, though the phrasing suggested a familiarity with language and a mind accustomed to layered meanings. There was a scholar referenced, unnamed, and a danger implied without specifying its form. It spoke of secrets buried beneath years of polite scholarship, of grievances and jealousies that fester quietly in cloisters and lecture halls. One line caught my attention, particularly the misquotation of a poet I had once read as a student, slightly altered, slightly askew, as though the writer intended the deviation to mark the point of emphasis. I noted it mentally, aware that the smallest inflection often illuminates intention. The content was ambiguous, neither threatening nor entirely benign. I considered the possibilities a warning, a prank, a misdirection, or a genuine appeal for attention. The choice of words, deliberate yet understated, indicated someone intelligent, careful, and observant. There was a rhythm to the sentences, a cadence that suggested the hand of someone accustomed to classical structures. The anonymity, while superficially frustrating, added a layer of intrigue I found quietly stimulating. Oxford, after all, cultivates minds that can enmesh subtlety and malice with equal facility. I read the letter twice, each time noticing nuances missed before. The punctuation suggested impatience, or perhaps insistence on the spacing of words, a hidden pattern of emphasis. There were hints embedded in syntax, as if the lines themselves were a miniature puzzle. I thought of the crossword I had glanced at that morning in the Times, the obscure clue whose answer had evaded me. There is often a strange harmony between seemingly trivial observations and more pressing mysteries. The mind, if patient, connects the two in ways that feel almost musical. I considered who might have sent it. A visiting lecturer with a reputation for subtle vindictiveness, a reclusive don nursing a quiet grievance from decades past. Or perhaps a student, clever and mischievous, testing boundaries while wielding a precocious intellect. None of these possibilities could be dismissed outright, and yet I sensed a particular cadence, a sophistication that made the latter less probable, though still not impossible. The act itself, arriving at the flat, suggested familiarity with routine, knowledge of where to place the paper for maximum effect. I folded the letter slowly, tucking it into the breast pocket of my coat. Outside, the fog over the Cherwell still clung to the bridges and banks, imbuing the city with that spectral melancholy that seems to follow Oxford through all seasons. I walked briefly along the river, pondering the cryptic words, aware that the day ahead would demand patience, attention, and the kind of quiet deduction that reveals truth without announcing itself. Somewhere in the nuances of ink and paper lay the first whisper of what was to come, a thread that would lead into shadowed corridors and conversations half overheard, to a human motive as delicate and impenetrable as the morning mist. I arrived at the inn shortly after midday, the kind of riverside establishment that seems perpetually half-empty and perpetually busy with whispers that do not reach the ears of strangers. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots in a rhythm that spoke of age and carelessness in equal measure. The smell of damp wood and brewing ale filled the narrow hallway, a contrast to the crisp fog I had left by the river, and I felt a familiar sense of suspended time, as though the day existed solely to hold its secrets in quiet equilibrium. The inn's proprietor moved about behind the counter with habitual efficiency, greeting patrons with gestures that suggested recognition without engagement. I took a seat near the window, noting the angle of light across the worn table and the way it highlighted a small blot of ink, dried and almost invisible, on the ledger. I wondered what had been recorded there yesterday, last week, last year, and whether such trivialities might hold significance for the events unfolding beyond the fog-laden Cherwell. A visitor arrived, a scholar from one of the colleges, his coat damp at the hem, his tie slightly askew. He ordered tea, his voice quiet but deliberate, and as he spoke, I noted an odd inflection in the way he referred to the bridge, a subtle avoidance of the usual descriptors. It was nothing one could pinpoint without attentive listening, yet in that slight hesitation there lay the first trace of a concealed concern. I made a mental note, aware that these small inconsistencies often form the skeleton of a truth later revealed. The inn's register, placed negligently at the corner of the counter, drew my eye. I observed the entries for the past few days, the neat script, the variations in handwriting, the arrival of a car whose plate number would later prove significant. The way the scholar's signature lingered too long on the line, as though aware of observation, suggested an awareness of oversight. It is often in the unremarked gestures that the human heart leaves its faintest imprints. Overheard conversations added texture to the scene. A pair of students discussed a recent paper, the cadence of their voices hinting at rivalry and barely suppressed contempt. A couple of staff members exchanged half-formed phrases about a late-night visitor, the significance of which remained obscure. I listened without comment, absorbing the rhythms of speech, the micro-gestures, the kind of detail that can dissolve into the background for most, but not for someone trained to note nuance. I caught sight of a reflection in the window, someone seated behind me, hands crossed, eyes wandering too often toward the door. I did not turn, but I remembered the posture for later comparison with other observations. The alignment of chairs, the placement of cups, even the order in which sugar was added to tea is small and trivial, yet they possess the power to betray thought and intention when carefully catalogued. As I left the inn, the fog had thickened along the bank, a grey curtain shifting with the breeze. The impression remained that the inn itself was a microcosm of Oxford's complex interplay of intellect and subtle deception. Every gesture, every half-uttered phrase seemed to carry significance, a silent message waiting for the patient ear. The smoke over the Cherwell hinted still at more than it revealed, and I understood that this crossing of paths, these fleeting interactions, had already begun to set the stage for revelations that the day had not yet allowed. It was mid-morning when the news reached me, brought by Lewis with the kind of hesitant cadence that suggested he, too, felt the weight of it before fully articulating the words. A young scholar had been found along the towpath near Cherwell Bridge, collapsed in a manner that prompted cursory speculation of an accident. I recalled the mist still clinging to the river, the way it had blurred edges and softened form the morning I walked there, and I understood immediately that appearances might be deceptive, as they so often are in Oxford. I arrived at the scene to find a small cluster of onlookers, voices hushed, shoes sinking slightly in the damp earth. The body lay near the water's edge, the clothing damp, the angle of repose unnervingly still. There was a faint trace of mud along the hem, a smear of something that suggested contact with stone or the riverbank. I crouched, noting the position of hands and feet, the tilt of the head, the way the fog framed the figure as if part of the river's own melancholy. A bookmark protruded from a pocket, water-stained and fragile, yet undisturbed, a detail that suggested deliberate placement or a sudden interruption. Lewis murmured that the coroner suspected a heart attack or accidental slip, though the tone betrayed uncertainty. I looked past him, eyes tracing a series of footprints that veered toward the bridge, then abruptly ceased. One set, smaller and lighter, had approached, from the bank opposite, as though someone had watched and retreated. The pause, the hesitation, the direction of travel trivial to most, yet to me it hinted at observation, at a witness or participant too cautious to remain present. I noticed, too, a faint scent tobacco, subtle, not the sort that clings to clothing, but a residue in the damp air. Someone had been here shortly before the discovery, a human trace that demanded attention. And in the folds of the scholar's coat, a crease misaligned with the rest of the garment suggested hurried movement or resistance, imperceptible to the casual eye, but resonant to someone accustomed to detail. The interplay of human presence and absence framed the scene like punctuation in an unfinished sentence. A passer-by offered an account of a figure seen leaning over the bridge hours before, indistinct in the fog. I did not press, knowing recollections of this sort are malleable and often infuse themselves with interpretation. Yet I noted the direction of the gaze, the posture described, and tucked it away among other impressions, aware that it might later crystallize into something tangible. I lingered at the edge of the towpath, observing the water's slow current, the pattern of mist across the bridge's arches, the faint imprint of a boat's glide along the near bank. Each detail seemed to hum with possibility, and I felt the familiar ache of contemplation, the quiet curiosity that balances unease. The scholar's death, while seemingly abrupt, suggested narratives yet to be uncovered, motives, opportunity, the invisible threads of rivalry and resentment that Oxford cultivates with such ease. As I rose to leave, the bells of a nearby college tolled, their resonance deep and measured. I understood that the day's investigation would require patience and subtlety, that the surface of events rarely reveals the deeper truth, and that the first impressions of the mud, the bookmark, the faint scent, would be the key threads from which to begin the weaving of understanding. I recall entering the Bodleian that afternoon with a sense of both reverence and apprehension, the quiet hush of the reading rooms falling over me like a weightless shroud. The familiar scent of old paper and binding glue, mingled with the faint trace of polished wood, seemed to signal that here, if anywhere, secrets could be unearthed without disturbance. I made my way along the stacks, noting the soft echo of my own footsteps, the gentle creak of the floorboards beneath, the way the light shifted across the spines of ancient volumes, casting long, hesitant shadows. My attention was drawn to a marginalia in a rare edition, the ink faded but legible to one who looks closely and patiently. The notation was a ciphered poem, its lines irregular, rhythm uneven, as though deliberately obscured. I traced each word with my eyes, sensing a deliberate play upon ambiguity, the subtle dance between what was written and what was suggested. In it, I glimpsed a reference to the bridge, faint but precise, hinting at a grievance long buried, a private message hidden beneath layers of scholastic decorum. The poet, misquoted in one line, was unmistakable. The deviation appeared intentional, a silent signature that one could read only if attuned to nuance. I turned the pages slowly, aware that the slightest rustle could seem intrusive in this cathedral of intellect. Nearby, a fellow scholar bent over a desk, glasses perched low, absorbed in his own work, unaware that his movements mirrored, in miniature, the rhythms of secrecy I sought to unravel. He had entered the reading room moments before, his coat still damp from the morning fog, and in the sleeve a small crease hinted at the hurried concealment of some document or note. A trivial detail, perhaps, yet to me it suggested awareness of observation, a quiet, human trace. A second notation caught my eye, scrawled in pencil at the bottom of a page, a date, a name, a fragment of Latin. It seemed unremarkable until I realized the script matched an entry in the inn's ledger, the one I had observed days before. A bridge between two separate worlds, between quiet scholarship and the mundane reality of the city, subtly revealing a connection previously unnoticed. I made a mental note, tracing the line of thought without committing to any conclusion. Connections in Oxford often appear trivial until the right moment, when a small thread unravels the larger tapestry. As I rose to consult the card catalogue, I noticed the faint imprint of a fingerprint upon the edge of a folio, smudged but distinct. Its presence implied recent handling, deliberate or inadvertent, and offered an anchor for contemplation. I lingered over the library desk, observing the interaction of human presence with the material world, the placement of books, the alignment of chairs, and the careful avoidance of certain shelves. Each gesture carried an unspoken message, and I catalogued them quietly, understanding that human behavior rarely lies entirely. By the time I left the reading room, the fading afternoon light had softened further, the library's arches casting long shadows along the polished floors. I felt the familiar ache of discovery tempered by restraint, the knowledge that observation alone is rarely sufficient, that only careful synthesis, patience, and the attention to subtle detail can begin to illuminate truth. And somewhere in the folds of ink paper and forgotten margins, I sensed that the day's revelations had begun, delicate yet persistent, waiting to unfold in their own measured time. Lewis arrived shortly after midday, carrying a small sheaf of notes that seemed heavier than their bulk, as if the weight lay not in paper, but in the subtle tensions they conveyed. He spoke with his usual quiet earnestness, recounting the oddities observed by witnesses along the river and near the bridge, the sort of trivial details that might elude casual attention, yet form the architecture of a larger truth. There had been a delivery late in the evening before the discovery, a silhouette glimpsed briefly against the mist, and a meeting, clandestine or imagined, that nobody could confirm. I listened without interruption, aware that he often delivers not only facts, but the faintest tremor of emotion, the tacit suggestion that observation alone is rarely neutral. I took note of his phrasing, the way he occasionally hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the careful consideration of implication. One witness had spoken of a car parked too long by the bridge, the license plate half remembered, the driver's presence more inferred than seen. Another had noted a figure carrying a bundle of papers, bending over the railing with a motion almost imperceptible. On its own, each account was a shadow, insubstantial taken together. Patterns began to emerge, subtle and insinuating. While Lewis spoke, my eyes wandered briefly to the morning paper left open on the table. The crossword occupied the page, its obscure clue, about a literary reference prompting a mental spark. The answer, a single word, seemed to resonate with the events Lewis described concealment. Not the overt act of theft, but the quiet hiding, the deliberate misdirection, the selective revealing of presence and absence. I made the connection without announcing it, the kind of internal note that quietly rearranges perspective. We walked along the towpath afterward, observing the curve of the river where footprints had lingered in damp earth. Lewis pointed out the odd alignment of impressions, their spacing irregular, a rhythm that suggested hesitation, retreat, and perhaps the act of watching. I crouched to examine the soil, noting the subtle depression of a heel, the partial imprint of a boot, and the faint trace of a second weight shifting abruptly. These were not immediately significant to anyone else, but to me they formed the punctuation of human intent, the pause between thought and action made manifest in mud. Lewis reflected on the scholars' last known meetings, mentioning the timing of a letter and a delayed lecture, the discrepancies small but persistent. He noted the faint perfume lingering near the inn's entrance, and I remembered the scent I had noticed days before, realizing the strands were converging. It is in these minor overlaps, these coincidences that might seem incidental, that the skeleton of motive often begins to reveal itself. By the time we returned to the city's quieter streets, I felt the subtle tightening of awareness, the quiet echo of connections forming in shadow. Oxford, with its bridges, cloisters, and narrow lanes, thrives on the interplay of intellect and secrecy, and I was reminded again that what appears casual, fleeting, or inconsequential rarely is. The observations Lewis brought, combined with the faint clues tucked into the margins of conversation and circumstance, offered a tapestry that might, with patience, disclose a pattern otherwise invisible, waiting to be read with the precise and deliberate care such matters demand. I found the Don in his chambers, a room as cramped and cluttered as it was silent, the air heavy with the scent of aging paper and the faint tang of pipe tobacco long extinguished. The windows overlooked a narrow quadrangle, its cobblestones slick with recent rain, and the light that filtered through cast a dull glow across stacks of books and scattered manuscripts. He sat behind a desk that seemed chosen less for work than for isolation, the chair worn at the edges, the surface marked with impressions of pens, stamps, and cups long emptied. I noted these details without comment, aware that the room itself might reveal as much as its occupant, and perhaps more. The Don's eyes lifted slowly when I entered, the expression cautious, measured, almost wary of intrusion. He spoke of the morning in clipped sentences, referencing the bridge, the scholar, and a lecture he had delivered weeks before. I observed the subtleties in his tone, hesitations at particular words, slight inflections that betrayed a memory he wished to shield, a posture that was both formal and defensive. There was a moment when his gaze flicked toward a ledger on the side table, the motion fleeting yet deliberate, suggesting awareness of a record or recollection I had not yet probed. I allowed him to speak, listening as he recounted minor details of the victim's recent engagements, noting discrepancies in timing, locations, and participants. It was in the small gestures, the turning of a page, the careful placement of spectacles on the desk, that hints emerged. One hand rested slightly crooked over a sheet of notes, the crease not accidental, indicating a hurried consultation or a concealed mark. The Don's choice of words hinted at both erudition and emotional restraint, each phrase a potential key to underlying tensions I was not yet prepared to unlock. He mentioned the scholar's temperament in passing, his phrasing imbued with a measured ambivalence, admiration, tempered by subtle criticism. The way he emphasized one word over another, the almost imperceptible sigh at intervals, suggested knowledge of events or intentions not directly stated. I filed each observation quietly, knowing that in Oxford, intellect often masks feeling and concealment is a practiced art. Even the most learned individuals leave traces if one watches closely enough. A glance at a manuscript revealed pencil markings, corrections, and annotations that diverged from the known text, hinting at an alternative interpretation or a private note intended for no one but himself. The deviation was slight, but it resonated with a pattern I had observed in prior correspondences, misquoted lines, subtle emphasis, cryptic allusions, each a potential breadcrumb toward comprehension. I could not yet ascertain whether these were relevant to the events at the bridge, but they demanded retention, the mind-storing minutiae like a ledger of intentions. As I left the chambers, the Don's figure receding into shadow, I felt the familiar ache of uncertainty, the delicate tension between trust and suspicion. Oxford had produced yet another mind both brilliant and wounded, a scholar whose knowledge might illuminate or obscure, whose pride could be as lethal as any overt act. I understood that each gesture, each misaligned annotation, and each carefully modulated word could serve as evidence in a case where human ambition and quiet resentment intersected with fatal consequences. The bridge, the mist, and the subtle traces left behind awaited synthesis, and I carried these observations with the slow patience that such a city and such a crime demand. I remember the afternoon as a convergence of subtle revelations, the kind that arrive in fragments and linger just beyond certainty. A diary had come into my possession, its leather cover soft and worn, the pages yellowed and faintly scented with ink that had long since dried. Within it, a scholar had recorded meetings, notes, and confidences, some mundane, others cryptic, as though aware that a reader might one day stumble upon them. The bridge was mentioned again fleetingly, almost as if the writer sought to obscure the significance of the encounter rather than draw attention to it. I traced the entries carefully, noting times, names, and the rhythm of their handwriting, the There was a convergence of meetings, one that had not appeared in any ledger or official record, a crossing of paths between the victim and another individual whose presence I had not anticipated. The notation of a particular location, a private study within the college, suggested an exchange meant to remain invisible to casual observation. The very act of recording it so carefully hinted at a consciousness of risk, an awareness that trust can be both a shield and a snare. I considered the small gestures describing the folding of a note, the subtle adjustment of a pen, a glance toward a window, each seemingly trivial, yet when juxtaposed with other observations, began to suggest intention. It reminded me of the crossword clue I had puzzled over earlier that week, the answer relating to concealment. It was a word whose implications now resonated with these movements. Nothing is ever entirely exposed, and the mind often hides in plain sight. The diary revealed more than logistical details. It hinted at emotional undercurrents, the delicate balance of admiration and resentment, of curiosity and fear. The scholar's writing was careful, almost poetic, embedding nuance in the choice of verbs and the spacing of lines. One passage described a conversation in which laughter was present but tempered by unease, a subtle tension detectable only to a patient observer. It occurred to me that understanding human motive often requires attending to what is unsaid as much as to what is spoken. I took the diary to a window overlooking the quadrangle, the fading light slanting through the high glass, illuminating the script in a way that revealed its variations, the slight pressure indicating hesitation or emphasis. The patterns suggested that some of these confidences were shared in moments of urgent disclosure, while others were recorded later with the benefit of reflection. I sensed the scholar's attempt to reconcile truth with discretion, a balancing act as delicate as the mist upon the Cherwell. Outside, the fog had thickened, wrapping the bridge and river in the muted palette of late afternoon. I recalled the slight shift in posture of the donor I had observed days earlier, the way his eyes lingered on particular objects as though aware of a larger design. These fragments, when combined with the diary, suggested a convergence of knowledge and secrecy, a crossing of confidences whose significance might only be fully appreciated once the web of observation and inference was complete. As I closed the diary and replaced it carefully upon the shelf, I felt the familiar ache of anticipation, that quiet tension between curiosity and the slow accrual of understanding. The threads were beginning to intertwine, forming a subtle pattern that demanded patience and attentiveness, the kind of deliberate consideration that Oxford cultivates in both its architecture and its intellect. And I knew that in these crosses of confidence lay both danger and revelation, awaiting the quiet diligence necessary to bring them to light. I remember returning to the bridge in the late afternoon. The fog thickened now to a near tangible density, muffling sound and softening edges. My thoughts had lingered over every observation accumulated in the diary, the ledger, the marginalia in the library volumes. Each seemed discreet, yet I had a sense that the truth resided not in grand gestures but in minutiae, in the minor details that slip past ordinary notice and yet resonate profoundly once recognized. It was in such slivers of evidence that I had learned Oxford's secrets were most often concealed. I crouched beside a faint scrape along the stone parapet, previously unnoticed. The mark was shallow, yet the pattern suggested more than a casual brushing of boots. It indicated deliberate contact, the kind made when a hand or object is guided carefully. I traced it with a gloved finger, aware that someone had engaged with this very surface minutes or hours before the body was discovered. The angle implied intent or deliberation, a small act performed with consciousness. It occurred to me that the answer to the odd coincidences Lewis had relayed might reside here in something the city's fog had hidden from all but the most attentive observer. A thought returned to me from the morning crossword. The clue, its obscure reference to concealment, now echoed against this minor mark, suggesting not only physical concealment, but the psychological intention and misdirection intertwined. The scholar's diary hinted at this pattern of subtle obfuscation. The ledger corroborated it in fleeting entries. The Don's guarded gestures now aligned with this invisible lattice of observation. Each had left a trace, almost imperceptible, yet collectively forming the architecture of the crime. I noticed the faint imprint of a heel, smaller than the majority of footprints along the path, partially washed by the river's edge. Its position was deliberate, placed to avoid drawing attention, yet the arc of its approach suggested observation. Someone had been present, calculated in timing, careful in movement, leaving only a shadow of evidence. I crouched for several minutes, taking in the patterns, the shifts in light, the way fog clung to stone, reflecting a silence more telling than words. It was a small tableau, ephemeral and delicate, yet pregnant with implication. As I straightened, my eyes caught a subtle indentation in the bank where the scholar had been found, something no one had remarked upon: a disturbance in the mud, a slight depression beside a tuft of reeds. It was nearly invisible, yet its alignment with the scrape and the smaller footprint indicated that movement here had not been accidental, that the scholar's final position might have been influenced by a presence unseen. A minor detail, overlooked by others, yet to me a hinge upon which the broader understanding might pivot. Walking back toward the city, I felt the familiar ache of anticipation, the quiet certainty that insight often arrives most profoundly through such trifles. Oxford yields its truths sparingly, not in sudden revelation, but through patient accumulation of minute observations of gestures, scratches and marks that, when read together, speak louder than testimony or confession. The bridge, the fog, and the faint smudges upon stone had begun to whisper a narrative hidden beneath surface appearances, a narrative that demanded the quiet, deliberate attention for which I had long trained myself, and which alone would illuminate the shadowed intent behind the day's earlier events. I arrived at the chambers with a quiet anticipation, the corridors of the college unusually hushed, as if the stone walls themselves had taken a measure of the day's tension. The door was ajar, and I pushed it gently, allowing the soft light from the tall window to spill across the floorboards. The figure within rose slowly, a hand brushing a book from the desk, eyes wary, the posture measured but not defensive. I had pieced together the strands of observation and inference over the past days, and yet the resolution felt delicate, a fragile alignment of intellect and circumstance. I spoke of the bridge, of the river, of the minor details, the scrape on stone, the depression in mud, the diary entries, and the ledger. Each was mentioned with the casual precision of a cataloguer of curiosities, rather than accusation, though the effect was unmistakable. I noted the way the figure's hands tightened briefly, then relaxed, a subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, yet revealing the tension of recognition. It was the smallest flicker, the kind of clue that comes from watching a human being in the act of containment. The discussion turned to the scholar, the meetings, the clandestine exchanges, the crossing of confidences recorded in pen and ink. The culprit's voice wavered ever so slightly, the cadence betraying both pride and the faintest trace of guilt. There was a pause when I mentioned a line from a poem misquoted in correspondence, the repetition of a word I had observed in both diary and letter. The alignment of text and gesture, word and pause, was a subtle confirmation of involvement, the kind of human signature that cannot be forged. I did not need to demand confession. The small inconsistencies, the gestures, the careful attention to which passages were emphasized, the avoidance of certain topics, each carried its weight. It became clear that ambition, wounded pride, and envy had converged in the mind of this scholar, that a carefully considered act had cascaded into unintended consequences. There was an almost literary symmetry to the act, a tragic rhythm underscored by the precise, deliberate orchestration of misdirection. I recalled the earlier puzzle of the minor detail, the heel in mud, the scrape on stone, the faint scent in the air, and realized how it had all converged at this moment. The clues, though individually minor, were orchestrated in combination, each supporting the subtle architecture of guilt. I observed, catalogued, and allowed the implication to settle like a tide receding to reveal the stones beneath. There was no triumph, only the quiet acknowledgement of human fallibility, the recognition of how intellect and emotion can intertwine to destructive effect. The figure remained seated after a moment, the expression softened with the admission that recognition alone could not erase consequence. I stepped back, aware that the resolution was not in dramatics but in comprehension, that justice, tempered by observation and intellect, often arrives quietly. Outside, the river flowed as it always had, the fog now receding to reveal bridges and banks unchanged by human passion or folly. I felt the familiar ache, the melancholy satisfaction of pattern discerned, human motive acknowledged, yet unromanticized. It was, as always, a case resolved in the mind, less in spectacle, more in the patient alignment of thought, gesture, and circumstance. The day had grown long by the time I returned to Cherwell, the river now reflecting the waning light in muted streaks of gold and grey. The fog that had clung to the bridge in earlier mornings had dispersed, leaving the water calm and indifferent, flowing past arches and banks that had witnessed both trivial and tragic human acts. I walked slowly along the towpath, my thoughts returning over the day's observations. The diary, the ledger of gestures and glances, and the quiet satisfaction of pattern discerning settled upon me like the first shadow of evening. I paused at the edge of the bridge, looking down at the river and recalling the position of the body, the minor details that had seemed insignificant, at first the scrape, the faint heel print, the alignment of mud and stone, and how each had converged to reveal intention and consequence. It was always in these subtle indications overlooked by casual sight that the truth manifests. Oxford teaches patience in such matters, a tacit lesson of intellect and observation, where understanding often comes not in revelation, but in quiet assembly of fragments. Nearby, Lewis approached, carrying his own notes, the expression on his face reflecting the subdued recognition that the work of deduction is never dramatic in its conclusion. He remarked upon the alignment of events, the unusual intersections of habit, root, and intent. I acknowledged the pattern, considering how the scholar's pride and the culprit's careful orchestration had shaped the tableau, each action a line in a broader narrative written in gestures and choices rather than words. The minor coincidences, the intersections of observation, had combined to form a lattice work of comprehension. As we walked along the bank, the echoes of bells in the distant college quadrangle punctuated the silence, a reminder that the city continues in its routines, indifferent to human folly. I considered the individuals involved, their motivations, their small triumphs and quiet regret. It is seldom the case that intellect aligns with morality in Oxford. Ambition often runs parallel to desire, envy coiling alongside curiosity. The resolution, then, is less about triumph than comprehension, the understanding of human frailty within its own context. I lingered by the water, noting the gentle ripple against the riverbank, the light shifting with the descending sun, the faint impression of a boat's passage hours before. Even as the case concluded in the ledger of observation, the river maintained its indifferent continuity. The minor details that had brought clarity, footprints, scuffs, annotations, gestures, remained like small stones submerged yet shaping the current, shaping the comprehension of those patient enough to observe. Lewis and I walked back toward the city, the evening air carrying the faint scent of damp earth and river mud. There was a quietness to the streets now, the day's activity settling into repose, and I felt the familiar ache of understanding that patterns are rarely perfect, motives rarely pure, and yet perception, patience, and intellect can render coherence from the apparent randomness of human action. I considered the bridge, the water, the scholar, and the minor yet telling details that had guided observation to clarity. By the time I returned to the flat on St. Aldate's, dusk had fallen. I looked once more at the Cherwell, the river reflecting a sky now muted and sombre. There was no triumph in the water's flow, no ceremony in comprehension, only the quiet resolution of the mind, the acknowledgement of human error, and the melancholy that accompanies understanding. The day had yielded clarity, yet the city and its people remained as inscrutable as ever, continuing in the shadows and light of Oxford, carrying secrets that may never be wholly known. The evening settled over Cherwell with a kind of quiet inevitability, the river's surface catching the last hints of amber from the lowering sun. Smoke from distant chimneys rose in lazy columns, dissolving into the pale sky, a reminder of ordinary life continuing beyond the matters of intellect and misfortune that had occupied the day. I walked along the towpath, the boards damp from recent drizzle, the scent of river mud mingling with the faint traces of burning wood. There was a softness to the air, a hush that seemed almost conspiratorial, as though the city itself acknowledged the day's events and yet withheld judgment. I paused at the bridge, noting the way the fading light fractured across the arches, casting shadows that shifted imperceptibly with each ripple of the current. The water carried reflections of the trees, the stone, and the occasional glint of window pane, but it remained unremarkable in its constancy, indifferent to human triumph or failure. I considered the minor details that had guided the investigation, the scrape along the parapet, the faint heel in mud, the margin notes in the diary, and felt the quiet satisfaction of comprehension, tempered by the melancholy that always accompanies understanding of human frailty. There was a stillness in which observation felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that Oxford cultivates within its cloisters and along its quays. I noticed a faint imprint along the riverbank, subtle and nearly overlooked, as though the day had left a trace of itself for only the most patient eyes to discern. I crouched briefly, absorbing the minor detail, aware that such observations often speak louder than testimony or confession, carrying the resonance of intention and human frailty in a way that words cannot. The smoke above the town shifted slowly in the evening air, curling into shapes that suggested but did not define, as if hinting at truths that cannot be fully grasped. I recalled the scholar, the reclusive don, the diary entries and the ledger threads of human ambition, envy and quiet pride, interwoven into a fabric more complex than any casual observer could imagine. Each gesture, each hesitation, each misplaced word had contributed to the understanding that now settled in my mind, yet nothing altered the river's quiet flow or the city's indifferent continuity. I lingered on the bridge, thinking of the minor coincidences that had aligned so precisely: the brief exchange on the towpath, the careful concealment of notes, the subtle inflection in a phrase. They were fragments that, in combination, revealed intention, consequence, and the inevitable human errors born of pride and secrecy. The fog of days past had dissipated, yet the residual melancholy remained, a delicate echo of motives and actions that will not vanish entirely. As darkness gathered fully, I turned slowly, following the river's edge back toward the city streets, noting the shadows lengthen along the cobbles, the quiet movement of figures returning to routine, and the faint illumination of lamps against stone. There was a rhythm to the night, a measured cadence, that mirrored the quiet understanding I carried with me. Knowledge had been discerned, human motives revealed, yet the city retained its inscrutability, its enduring mystery. I paused briefly, inhaling the faint smoke and the damp river air, aware of the continuity of Oxford, the constancy of water, the permanence of minor traces, and the delicate balance between what is known and what is forever hidden. In this moment of smoke and silence, I understood that comprehension is rarely complete, that resolution is tempered by the melancholy of human imperfection, and that even the quietest details can speak volumes if one is willing to listen.